Welcome to the Real News Network. I'm Dharna Noor, joining you from Baltimore. Many are still stunned by Donald Trump's victory in the U.S. presidential election. Some are beginning to predict the next shocking upset by a right-wing populist candidate. And some eyes are turning to France, where Marine Le Pen is expected to be the 2017 presidential candidate for the political party, the National Front. The party is known for its inclusion of Nazi sympathizers during its creation in the early 70s and its use of overtly anti-Semitic rhetoric, but an upcoming article written by French advocate Yasser Louati argues that to understand the rise of the right in France, we should also examine its use of Islamophobia. Yasser joins us today from Paris to speak more about this. He's a civil liberties and human rights advocate. Thank you so much for joining us again.
Thank you for having me.
So could we begin by talking about where exactly Islamophobia in France comes from and where it's observable? How did it come to exist and how is it affecting the lives of everyday Muslim people?
Well, Islamophobia has, is deeply rooted within France's colonial past. Before it was the anti-Arab and anti-Black sentiment, but now since it became kind of taboo to keep inserting blacks and Arabs because of their origin or skin color. Now the argument being used is that well, we are only criticizing their religion. The problem is that they demonize their religion and then they demonize the people who practice it. It has been increasing slowly but surely in the 80s and 90s, but more tremendously since French Muslims have become more and more visible. The first cases of Islamophobia were noted in the late 80s when a public school expelled two students for wearing the headscarf. Back then, such opinions were a tiny minority, a loud one, but still a tiny one. And that's why the state kept protecting these young girls going to public schools when they wore the headscarf. What happened is that within 15 years, the ones who were a minority in the late 80s have now become capable of passing bills to specifically target French Muslim citizens. It began with laws prohibiting the headscarf in public schools and public offices, then the law prohibiting the full-face veil, then laws prohibiting veiled nannies from working from home, etc., etc. Then we have the normalization of Islamophobic rhetoric under the pretext that these people are only criticizing the Islamic religion, when in fact they are just demonizing the people who practice it. Islamophobia is not about prohibiting criticism of religion, but it's about protecting the dignity and the rights of human beings because they are perceived or assumed to be Muslims. By the early 2000s, it has become a tremendous problem and a daily challenge for Muslims, especially women, who represent 80% of the victims. You add to it the fact that, for example, if you are a Muslim citizen in France, you are 4 times less likely to be getting a phone call for a job application. If you are a Muslim woman wearing a headscarf, you have 1% chances of getting a job or a phone call back. If you are an Arab in France, you are 9 times more likely to be racially profiled by the police. And if you are a black person, it is 7 times. You add to it the fact that the prime minister himself can get into racist rhetoric, saying, for example, that the Muslim headscarf should be an essential fight for the republic. The Minister of Women's Rights, Laurence Rossignol, for example, compared Muslim women wearing the headscarf to, quote, Negroes or American Negroes who were in favor of slavery. All of that makes it that Islamophobia has become an acceptable form of racism, because all kinds of racism is supposed to be prohibited, but if it comes to Islamophobia, to quote, for example, one of the famous lobbyists on the left, or the so-called left-wing liberals, it is okay to be Islamophobic, and one shouldn't be afraid to be called an Islamophobe.
Now, you've argued that Islamophobia in France has actually replaced anti-Semitism as the new acceptable form of racism and bigotry. What do you mean by this? Are you suggesting that anti-Semitism is no longer a problem in France?
Anti-Semitism remains a problem. The question is that, anti-Semitism, and to quote to you, for example, the the French Jewish Union for Peace, or, for example, the Israeli scholar Shlomo Sand, the French state is more ruthless against anti-Semitism, but is doing nothing against Islamophobia. As a matter of fact, it is also promoting it. And that's not doing a favor to our Jewish fellow countrymen and women, because that feeds into the conspiracy theories somehow the Jews would be or are controlling France. Of course, that is not true, but any anti-Semite will use that and say, see, they are allowing, for example, people to insult anybody. They can insult the Christian religion, they can insult Muslims, they can insult any other person. But if it comes to the Jewish citizens, then the French state all of a sudden becomes active against it. The other thing we should keep in mind is that there is a violent and vicious campaign in order to equate anti-Zionism and anti-Semitism. And that's again doing a disfavor to our Jewish brothers and sisters, because again, that is holding accountable Jewish citizens for the actions of Israel. And when you mix all of that, the atmosphere is quite toxic. You have Islamophobia on one side, and you have anti-Semitism on the other. And to show you that, for example, anti-Semitism is deeply rooted within French society, what do people say after January 2015? They said, "Je suis Charlie," I am Charlie. Nobody said, "Je suis Juif," or "I am Jewish." And for example, if you look at the press coverage and how the 11th of January was celebrated in order to say, well, France is a free country, etc., what was held sacred was the right to insult Muslims, with Charlie Hebdo, for example. But nobody spoke about the Jews, for example, who got killed just for being Jews. And in my humble opinion, if you are killed for who you are, it's much worse than being killed for what you say or do.
Now, you also argue that Islamophobia is playing a part in the increasing support for the far-right party, the National Front. Talk about this. How has the National Front used the prevalence of Islamophobia in France to its advantage?
Well, the National Front made a strategic turn by the early 2000s, when Jean-Marie Le Pen, who is a notorious anti-Semite, began giving way to his daughter to take over the party. His daughter switched from her father's anti-Semitism and turned to Islamophobia. She's the person, for example, who will tell you, well, the Muslims who pray on the street for lack of space in mosques or for not having mosques at all, such prayers are comparable to the Nazi occupation and should therefore be resisted. When she constantly demonizes Muslims, not by saying we are against Muslims as such, but by using, as in the US, militant Islam, radical Islam, Islamists, Islamic Brotherhood, etc., without ever defining it, or putting a seal between being a Muslim and being a dangerous political activist. You add to it the fact that every single city being held by the Front National is openly against the local Muslim community. In every single city being governed by the Front National, Muslims are facing hardships, either to keep their mosques, to build one, or even to continue their ongoing projects.
Now, your upcoming article will also explore a connection between the far right in France, Russian oligarchs, and the UAE. Can you speak about this a little bit? Explain how this is relevant.
Well, first, it shows the blatant hypocrisy of the so-called right and even the far right in France. They are here, bragging about the love of France and patriotism, etc., and telling Muslims and demanding for them to show love for the country when they are themselves being heavily funded with foreign money. For example, Marine Le Pen last year secured 2 loans totaling 11 million euros from Russian oligarchs. She went to Russia, for example, and met with the head of the parliament and the head of the Foreign Affairs Committee. And right when she came back, she started supporting Russian foreign policy. The same thing happened with the UAE. She secretly met with a UAE envoy a few months ago in her mansion in the west side of Paris. And after that meeting, she managed to get into financial deals with the UAE. And they said they would fund her presidential campaign. But afterwards, she came out saying that we should support the UAE against Qatar and we should support the dictator of Egypt, the Marshal al-Sisi, etc., etc. So you see that money given to this party equates a public stance to support that country's foreign policy. We can also speak, for example, of Nicolas Sarkozy, who is France's former president, and who got not less than 50 million euros from Muammar Gaddafi in Libya. 50 million
He's now
euros.
facing allegations about this, that he took these millions of euros from Gaddafi's government. So talk about how this Islamophobia has impacted sort of the relationships between the French government and the relationship with governments abroad, especially with Muslim countries.
Well, first, the French government has failed or has been failing for the past 40 years to treat French Muslim citizens as fully fledged citizens. That's for one thing. They keep sending them back to their countries of origin. You can't do that with people from the second, third, and fourth generation. It might be acceptable for their parents, but it's unacceptable to keep treating second, third, and fourth generation French citizens as foreigners. When you have the French government constantly doing that, and at the same time, getting involved in the internal affairs of the Muslim religion, telling Muslims who should speak and who should be quiet. When you have, for example, the French president setting up the so-called Foundation on French Islam and appointing a French person who has no Muslim background, as a matter of fact, who was, governing a part of Algeria during the colonial era. All of that. And when you add to it that the state is not acting against the massive daily discriminations Muslims are facing, the police brutality they have to cope with in their neighborhoods, the growing hostility in the French public sphere, in the media, etc. And when you see the French government with the single initiative being launched against Islamophobia being hashtag let's be united against hatred, but nothing concrete in terms of bills, nothing concrete in terms of fining people who discriminate, etc. All of that comes down to a relationship of hostility between Muslims and the government, because, and they are right, French Muslims do not trust the French government. It has failed to address this racism. It has also been promoting it. It has also failed to sack ministers and members of parliament or members of the government who promote Islamophobia. And now they tell Muslims they should be even more, patriotic. The Burkini case, for example, is a blatant case of how things are turning in France. If you compare with what's happening in the US, you had all this identity issues in the US with Trump. The same thing happened with the Burkini issue, because the Burkini hysteria of last November was actually the go sign for the presidential election, and making it based on identity issues. The presidential election in France for the coming months would be about socioeconomic policies, corruption, mass unemployment, healthcare, transportation, etc. It will only be based about Muslims or French Muslims being an inherent threat to French identity. And since people don't negotiate their identities, well, you are bound to go into a clash. And that's exactly what politicians are looking for in France in order to avoid questioning austerity measures and the neoliberal agenda, and of course, corporate assault on the French institutions.
Thank you so much for joining us.
Thank you for having me.
And thank you for joining us on the Real News Network.